And to Curran, moments ago, we had the report, it's a common thing, on China aircraft in Taiwanese airspace, and it did move the markets. When we get that headline, does it move the needle of emotion in your Hong Kong?
Well, good morning, Tom. Look, it is another example of why Taiwan is such a flashpoint. These air incursions do seem to be happening with more frequency recently. And China is pushing back against some of the steps that the Biden administration has taken on Taiwan since they came to office. For example, stepping up liaison or making it easier for liaison with Taiwan, sending those former US officials to Taiwan a few weeks ago. So China has been pushing back hard and making clear it continues to push a line that it considers Taiwan to be part of its internal affairs and pushes back against meddling against it. And don't forget, of course, that Taiwan is also right in the middle of this global economic fault line, which is the shortage of semiconductors. So it's of massive strategic importance now, both to the US and the global economy. And China, of course, is trying to advance its own semiconductor technology at the same time. So I think Taiwan is absolutely the global flashpoint between China and the US, and there's no sign of a circuit breaker or that changing anytime soon, Tom.
Triangulate the economics between Beijing, Taipei, Hong Kong, and for that matter, triangulate over to Washington. What's the state of the back and forth, the ebb and flow of that economics?
Well, there's a little bit of a pushback now against China. I mean, Tom, as you know, of course, the US had been leading this hawkish trade policy against China for some years, but now we're getting a sense that perhaps Europe is coming on board that a little bit as well. Our own colleagues today reporting that, for example, the chancelleries and governments of Europe are growing colder in relations with China. There's probably now more reluctance to ratify that investment deal that Europe and China agreed only as recently as January. And on the Pacific front, an interesting example, Tom, is what's happening in Australia. The government there now has announced a review of a China leasehold on a port in Darwin. And that's interesting because that was signed off by all of Australia's top security agencies only 5 years ago. But here we are now where Australia is mulling whether or not that was the right thing to do. There's also tensions continuing to flare with the Philippines over the South China Sea. So I think that China is certainly battling tensions on many fronts with key trading partners and with key economies around the world. It's because this whole trade and technology and human rights tension is now moving beyond just a China-US bilateral thing to more of a global and regional and global, I think, front of many tensions between China and key trading partners.
That's exactly where I wanted to go, Enda, this idea that G7 foreign ministers are meeting in London this week, and a main discussion is some collaboration with how to approach China. What is China's response to the closer alliance between the U.S. and Europe generally with respect to establishing a new dynamic globally with China?
Well, it will be very interesting, Lisa, to see how that plays out. I mean, there's no doubt that there are some among the G7 who are pushing for this kind of alliance, like-minded democracies against China on the economic front and on the human rights front. But there are signs of that isn't fully cohesive either. I mean, New Zealand, for example, has signalled a flag of caution when it comes to the use of, in terms of its own role in backing this alliance against China, in terms of the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, for example. It will be interesting to keep an eye on how that develops. As I mentioned earlier, this investment agreement between China and the EU that was signed only in January is now no longer a done deal. And you look at the tensions that are happening with Australia and others that were once, fairly benign economic partners of China. There's no doubt that there is something now of a cooling of relations, and that would, I think, give scope for the G7 to pull together some kind of an alliance on this. But as I say, it's far from a done deal. Germany continues to talk about, for example, the importance of its relationship with China. So there's some criticism and pushback, but I don't think there's any kind of a wholesale alliance of the kind that some would argue for.
And we're 7 minutes away from finding out the trade deficit in the United States for the month of March. The expectation is it will be a new record with respect to the trade deficit. A lot of the money going to China, which has been shipping a lot of goods to the United States. How much has the rhetoric not matched with the action when it comes to the economic balance, the economic relationship between the U.S. and China?
Chinese trade to the US is going gangbusters, Lisa. I mean, we speak to manufacturers a lot, and they all tell you that their biggest issue is actually meeting demand from US clients. It's almost as though the trade war never happened. There's no doubt that the big revival on the Chinese industrial and production side of things was driven by the big rebound in the US and continues to be driven by it. In fact, there's been analysis that some of the Biden stimulus will eventually spill over to Chinese companies. So there's no doubt, there is something of a dual track. As you mentioned, we do have on the one level these geopolitical tensions, human rights tensions, security tensions and concerns over technology and the rest. But as you say, the merchandise goods trade between the two world's biggest economy, the US and China, especially from China to US, that's just going gangbusters and going from strength to strength, and it certainly has helped lift China's economy and get it back on the and to help it on the V-shaped recovery that it has enjoyed since the pandemic broke out a year ago.